Our gospel lesson today is from the 24th chapter of Luke, beginning with verse 13. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered Jesus, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" And Jesus asked them, "What things?" And they replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and beside all this, it's now the third day since these things took place, and moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it was just as the women had said, but they didn't see Jesus." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus interpreted to them the things about himself and all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So Jesus went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was still talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. And they were saying, "The Lord is risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how Jesus had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The Gospel of the Lord. This is one of those weeks where I think the message for the adults isn't so different from the message for the children. There are lots of times where there are things that are familiar to us that we think we ought to be able to call right off the top of our heads. And somehow there's just a block. You know, I used to be really good at remembering phone numbers back in the day, back before cell phones. And for those of you who are under the age of about 20, yes, there was a day before cell phones. And yes, somehow we managed to live and find our way around. And I was just so good at remembering phone. I must have known 100 or 200 phone numbers off the top of my head that I could remember. But I got a new phone number when I moved up here for work in the hospice agency. And it took me 2 months to be able to remember just those 10 digits. Just because it had been so long since I've had to remember anything like that. You know, you think that some things are just really deeply ingrained in you, like, I don't know, use a cutting board. Or, you know, other things, though, that we've done for years, but maybe we don't do for a while, that just take a little bit longer to come back than we'd like. I remember the last time that we got bicycles. It took me 15, 20 minutes to be able to not stay up, but to feel like I was confident and competent on it again, because it had just been so long since I'd done it. And other than the cutting board thing, most of those things are pretty mundane. You know, it's not like it's going to make or break. But, you know, there are a lot of things in our lives that are habits that, you know, we have to use or we lose. You know, one of those things for me is the way you make small talk. And I know this sounds kind of silly, but I find that when I've been spending an awful lot of time being the role, you know, being the role of pastor, being the role of bereavement coordinator, where when I go somewhere, I go because I have a defined role and I have things that I'm supposed to do and I have things I know I'm going to talk about and I have words that I know I'm going to say and I have topics that I'm going to cover. And so I really, in a lot of cases, don't have to make a lot of small talk. I don't have to have the burden of trying to figure out what to say. And if you don't know me all that well, and sometimes if you do know me pretty well, one thing you might not know about me is that I just feel awkward everywhere I go. I'm an extrovert, and I like being around people, and I like talking to people, and I like spending time with people, and it gives me energy. You know, one of the hardest tasks that I have right now is preaching to actually looking at myself in a camera, and that is frustrating because I can't tell you how much of the energy that I get in preaching from looking out into the congregation and being able to see, well, they've been looking down for a little while. I wonder if I need to switch things up a little bit. And even right now, as I'm thinking about your faces in the congregation and not just having to see me in the camera, all of a sudden I feel more energy and I feel more comfortable because it's so familiar. But in the same way, preaching to myself is weird. You know, when I go into a social situation and I'm not wearing the badge, or I'm not wearing the role of bereavement coordinator, or I'm not wearing the role of Willow's dad or Lauren's husband, or you know, any of the other things that I fall into as a way of feeling safe and feeling like I have some way that I know that I belong where I am. I feel so out of place and so awkward because I just don't know what to say sometimes. And I'm sure I'm not the only person in history who's felt this way. But when I was reading this gospel for the first time this week, I spent a lot of time thinking about Cleopas and the other disciple he was with, who encountered Jesus, and you know, he asked them about what was going on, and they said, "Are you the only one who doesn't know?" You know, when you think about it, even back then when there weren't as many people roaming around the earth, on average, most of the people in the world that you would run into didn't know about the Jewish guy who got crucified by Rome on that Friday afternoon. A crucifixion in the Roman Empire wasn't exactly big news. And it wasn't necessarily big news that they had crucified someone who had been stirring up trouble for the people in their local community either. And so in some ways, you know, there's this thought that it would have made sense for him to say, well, which guy who was crucified on Friday? I mean, even just in the story, we know there were at least 3. But Jesus did something for them that he does for all of us. He asked them and invited them to share with him those things that were on their mind. He said, well, what things? You know, what things? 2 words. Such a simple sentence. It reminds me of John chapter 12 with the story of Jesus meeting Mary on the road when Lazarus had died. And one of the things that a lot of people like to remember, because it, in some translations, is the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. But why did Jesus weep? Jesus wept because Mary invited him to come and see. 3 words. But they're 3 words that welcome Jesus in. You know, we take for granted sometimes the power of an invitation. And not just because it feels good to be invited when we're in a crowd and we feel awkward, and somebody says to something along the lines of, well, you know, I'm going to go over here and talk to this person. Why don't you come with me? But there is something about being invited someplace by somebody, especially, you know, somebody we care about, or somebody we've known for a long time, or somebody we respect, or somebody maybe that we don't know but we've always wanted to meet, and all of a sudden they take time out of their life to bother to offer to spend a little time with you. And then there are those moments where, we are just so lost in ourselves and lost in what's going on in our lives, and lost in our grief and our sorrow or our anger or our shame or our pain or our frustration. And we can barely find the edge of our own identity, let alone anywhere we need to be going. And at that point, I don't think it really matters who it is that invites us. The person who invites us into their life is holy. The person who invites us into a space where they're willing to sit with us and share with us the things that we're going through, all of a sudden that becomes a sanctuary. The people who are willing to feed us not just with, the food that we like to eat, but with time and attention and love. We find in that relationship some sacramental experience in which we see Jesus just as plainly as we see him in the breaking of the bread, the pouring of the wine, body broken, blood shed. Because what's given to us is more than just the sacrifice of Jesus' death. But Jesus' death is the culmination of the sacrifice of Jesus' life for us. As God comes to us where we are and doesn't just do some cheap magic trick to make all the bad things go away. But God comes to us where we are and invites us into God's own presence and rejoices when we invite God back. Where in your life are you going to experience the breaking of the bread this week? Where are the unexpected places that Jesus is going to show up? Maybe where you need Jesus most. Or maybe Jesus is going to show up through you in the place where the person for whom you are Jesus needs you to be the most. Think and pray this week about the ways that God shows up for us in those places where we're feeling awkward and alone. And in those places where we would never expect God to be because we are just so filled up with everything that's going on around us that we can't even imagine that we have room for anything else. Pray this week that you will be able to recognize Jesus when you see him. And give thanks when others are able to see Jesus through you. Amen.